Hello all, this is week 3, part 3. I just completed talking about upcoming assignments for the week and now want to get going with our content. This week we are talking about informal assessments, two types, classroom-based, also known as diagnostic and formative assessments, as well as structured assessments. We are talking about anecdotal records and the article you will read or have already read. And then, most importantly, we want to look at getting started with your student since you will be starting sessions next week, week 4. So last week, quickly, we discussed formal assessment and formal assessment practices. We also reviewed the different forms and purposes of assessment. So you have screening to do an initial look at who might need some intervention services. We also talked about diagnostic assessments, which give you a deeper look into the student's needs as a learner. Progress monitoring is what you're using to determine if your instructional practices are effective or not. And then the outcome assessment is sometimes a summative assessment, but could be a formative assessment that gives you conclusive evidence as to whether or not your process of diagnosing, prescribing interventions, progress monitoring was ultimately effective. So each of those pieces are very important in the RTI framework. So we started to talk about how to set up an RTI framework and how you do need to start with some form of screening assessment. Typically, schools use a standardized formal assessment for screening, and I just want to remind you the importance of using a variety of assessments, multiple measures, and triangulating data to make these high stakes decisions that have major implications for students. All right, so that was last week. Let's move on to this week. We have 3 objectives. First, we are going to compare and contrast the classroom-based assessment with a structured informal assessment. They are both types of informal assessment but look a little differently. We're also going to describe anecdotal records and them as an assessment. And then lastly, you will be able to develop your weekly assessment plan for your first session, so you will know what pieces you need to include, and we'll be able to start working on that so you have it ready for week 4. I definitely recommend doing as much work you can this week since we don't have a lot of readings and assignments, so that you are ready for week 4. All right, if you have the 4th edition, we're talking about chapter 8. If you have the 5th edition, we are talking about chapter 9. And we are first talking about informal or classroom-based assessments, more of your formative assessments or the diagnostic assessments. These are really the opposite of norm-referenced standardized tests. They are tied to the curricular content and the instruction happening in the classroom. So these could even be conversations in the classroom, casual ones, where children are explaining their thinking. These can be used as assessment information in a classroom-based assessment. These are more fine-grained than external assessments, which can help teacher plan lessons. So a lot of times the teacher is the one creating these assessments and can directly align them to the instruction that is happening. So they can cater them to exactly what they want to find out that the students gained from their lesson, and then use that data immediately to form instruction. They are also focused on both the product and the process. So we don't want to be doing a lot of multiple choice formatting for the informal classroom-based assessment, but really looking at the product and the process. They give teachers immediate feedback, which is a huge benefit when you think about formal assessments and how long it takes to get those results back. With classroom-based assessments, you have the results immediately and you can use them immediately, and you can approach and provide instruction for misconceptions immediately. They also enable teachers to interact with the students, and consequently, the teacher can use that agency that they have to adapt the assessment to the individual learner. It is in this way that the assessment can be very responsive to a specific cultural or linguistic characteristic of individual students, which we talked about formal assessments having a lot of bias against different cultures and backgrounds and things like that. So formative assessment or classroom-based assessment can control for those different things. Examples of classroom-based assessments include running records that can be done during a student's oral reading. They could even be done as a student is orally reading in a small group or individually during a silent reading period. You can literally do those on the run, which is why they're called running records. You could do a 1-minute timed fluency assessment. That would be a classroom-based assessment. You could use the academic text that the students are currently reading, their textbook, to gauge what they are understanding, and you could pause at different stopping points and ask them about what they're thinking. Word sorts could be a classroom-based assessment if you're doing a phonics pattern of sorts. Any teacher-made formative assessment, whiteboard work, exit ticket, quick check, anything like that. Retellings of anything read could be a classroom-based assessment. Using various questioning strategies would also be a good classroom-based assessment. And then evaluating written products. And that could be with or without a rubric. A rubric is actually a structured informal assessment though. And lastly, observation checklists, which I like to use a lot, where you would just have all your students' names in one column, and then you'd have the criteria you were looking for in the other columns, and you could literally just check off who had mastered that skill or shown you that they have mastered that skill. All right, as Pinnell states, teachers need assessment tools that help them become noticing teachers, and that's cited in your course textbook. And noticing requires that teachers actually engage in careful observations of reading and writing as they occur in their own classrooms, but then also paying attention to the importance and significance of what they note. And so, like I was saying, even casual conversations can be an assessment as long as you're being a noticing teacher and you're paying attention to what you are observing and thinking about the significance or the importance of what you are noticing. So how do you become a noticing teacher? Well, you need to plan when and what you're going to notice, similar to your anecdotal records. You also need to listen, recognize any patterns in what you observe, and then reflect on what you've observed and why it's significant, and then use it to plan. And look beyond skill mastery. All right, limitations and pitfalls of the classroom-based assessments. You want to be aware of any informal assessment that gives you skills in isolation. Remember, we want to really assess the whole process of reading and not a simplification of that process. We want to be aware of tests that assume reading is a hierarchical process. So fluency doesn't precede comprehension. They both need to be happening at the same time. There also should be a relationship between how reading and writing is assessed and how it is produced. And again, make sure you have multiple sources and you aren't just using one assessment to make determinations. So the bottom line with classroom-based assessments, these very informal assessments taken on the run are helpful for planning and adapting daily instruction, but not as appropriate when you need specific information or a more in-depth look. So these are often the most informal of assessments on the scale, and they aren't always appropriate if you need to give a diagnostic maybe, and that is when you will need to look to these structured assessments, which are mentioned in chapter 9 of 4th edition and chapter 8 of the 5th edition. So what is a structured assessment? These are still informal assessments, not to be confused with formal tests that design a student score to other students. They are designed to evaluate a student's performance against a criteria for acceptable performance. So they are criterion referenced. For example, when you're looking at informal reading inventory, which is an example of a structured assessment, they need to score 90% or higher on comprehension in order for that text to be at their independent reading level. So there's a specific criteria that they need to meet, whereas on those classroom-based measures we were just talking about, there may or may not be such a rigid, specific criteria. These assessments also mimic classroom reading instruction, so they are more generalizable than formal assessments. Formal assessments aren't always authentic, which means they aren't always reliable or generalizable. They also contain specific procedures and materials to ensure consistent assessment practices. For example, you have the core measures of assessment and you also have the QRI. Both of these are structured assessments, and as such they have a specific protocol for you to follow. They have specific materials that should be used, and they also have directions for how you administer the assessment, even including sample items, specifically what the teacher should say, specifically what the teacher should do. So again, examples of these would be any informal reading inventory like the QRI, like the SERI, like the comprehensive reading inventory, the classroom reading inventory. There are many examples of IRIs. There are various structured assessments for study skills that your text mentions. A reading miscue inventory would be a structured assessment. The NAEP Oral Reading Fluency Scale is structured. It's actually a rubric. Any type of rubric would be a structured assessment. A word list, like Fry's word list, would be a structured assessment, as well as a spelling inventory, like Words Their Way. And again, anything from your core book or the QRI, that would be a structured assessment. There are consistent materials that you are using. So a quick word on informal reading inventories. These are individually administered reading tests that start with a graded word list that helps you determine what grade of passage to start with, so you aren't playing a guessing game there. The purpose of these is to place students in materials at the appropriate levels, independent, instructional, or frustration. They also help identify strengths and weaknesses in areas of word recognition and comprehension. So those are the two pieces really assessed with an informal reading inventory, although you could also look at vocabulary and see what tier of vocabulary words the student is missing in an informal reading inventory. So those are very, very useful, and they are one of the best structured assessments you can give, which is why we're going to be spending many weeks on how to give the QRI and informal reading inventories in general. All right, I'm going to stop there and come back and talk about anecdotal records in chapter 4, and then we will have one more piece after that.